Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. David Rosenblatt. I'd like to thank you for joining me for this Food Safety Fridays special recording. And I'd like to thank Simon and the people at IFSQN and our sponsors for organizing this recorded event. I'd also like to apologize to anybody who registered for our Food Safety Fridays live event that did not happen in the end because of technical issues. So we're recording it now. So those of you who are interested in the subject can enjoy the presentation anyway. So again, I apologize for not being live. If you do have any questions, please feel free to write me and I'll be happy to answer. I know it's not as good as being live, but it's better than nothing. So let's get started. I'm going to share my slideshow. And we'll proceed. So we're talking about good purchasing practices. This is a subject that I think has great importance and impact on the safety of our food supply chain. I'd like to start with a case study that has changed the way we think about the supply chain and purchasing practices in food safety, and it's also had a serious impact on regulation. And I'm talking about the Peanut Corporation case of 2008, which ended up in a terrible incident of over 700 hospitalizations, 9 people having died. And what went wrong in Peanut Corporation was that many food companies throughout the United States were purchasing peanut-based products as an ingredient for their products. The peanut products being supplied to them were contaminated with salmonella. And these companies that were putting the product into their products had trusted the certification system of their supplier and had not been doing regular supplier audits. And in their risk assessments, they were under the assumption that if you're purchasing a raw ingredient from a reliable certified supplier, then you can allow yourself not to manage that specific risk that could have been identified, in this case, salmonella in the ingredient. And this case, because so many organizations were affected and so many people were harmed, was sort of like a wake-up call for the industry, saying, can we really trust our food supply chain? Can we really trust our suppliers based on regulatory requirements only, or based on a third-party certification only? And the question is apparently sometimes yes, often no. It would depend on our risk assessment in a case-to-case basis. Following this event and other events in the United States, the American government passed a rule that they call the Food Safety Modernization Act. This act that was finalized in 2011 under the Barack Obama administration was, among other things, it was inspired or driven by the Peanut Corporation of America case. And I'm not going to go through a whole FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, what we call FSMA presentation here, but I do want to emphasize its role in helping us change the way we think about the food safety supply chain and our purchasing practices. And what FSMA requires in general is that every organization that manufactures food for the American population, whether it be in the United States or abroad, perform a hazard analysis. And all hazard analyses are based on identification of potential hazards, evaluation of their level of risk, and control of those hazards using various different preventive controls. And that's the idea behind HACCP, behind all food safety management systems. In this reasoning with this, FSMA did not invent anything new. They just put it into regulation, and that's the regulatory requirement. Now, if we're talking about the role of our suppliers within this specific risk assessment, then we can look at it from an overview that when we must identify potential biological, chemical, and physical hazards from every material and every process step. And I emphasize it, every material. So when we're doing a risk assessment, we're looking at our processes, of course, looking to identify any hazards, potential hazards within our process, but also every potential hazard that can be present in every material we purchase. So a risk assessment is going to be looking at every single ingredient, every single packaging material, every single processing aid or anything we're putting into our product that's coming into contact with it, and asking ourselves what are the risks that are, or the hazards that can be associated with this specific material. Just identifying the potential. And when we do this, we will disregard where it's coming from, what the chances are of it happening, who we're buying from. We're just going to identify the potential. This is what we call identification. And next we'll go on to evaluate, and evaluate is done by evaluating the severity and the likelihood before applying control measures. And one of the mistakes that organizations have been making when they do risk assessments is, okay, so let's say I'm a bakery and I'm buying pasteurized eggs that go into my product. The potential hazard is, for instance, salmonella, which is potentially present in raw eggs. The severity of salmonella is significant, but the likelihood of having salmonella in pasteurized eggs is low. So I can afford not to put a control measure in my process. Now, all this is true, but I made a mistake when I said that the severity of this happening is low because I'm buying pasteurized eggs. What I'm required to do is ask myself, what would be the potential of salmonella if I didn't have a reliable supplier, if my supplier couldn't be trusted? And even if he can be trusted, I'm not going to let that ruin the way I assess a hazard. So that's why FSMA, and in fact, all food safety management systems require us to evaluate the likelihood before applying control measures. In this case, before applying the control measure of working with a reliable, well-known, certified, blah, blah, blah supplier. So now I'm thinking differently. Now when I identify a potential hazard coming from raw material, I'm not going to assume that my supplier has controlled it. I'm going to have to verify this. I'm going to have to do something within my means to make sure that that's happening. Think about the organizations who were buying peanut-based, roasted peanuts with salmonella from the Peanut Corporation of America in 2008. They were under the assumption that the specific hazard of salmonella in peanuts, which is a well-known hazard, we didn't come across it for the first time in 2008. There have been many people harmed from salmonella coming from poorly roasted peanuts in recent years before the PCA event. So organizations were aware of the hazard. They were controlling it by buying their product from a supplier that they assumed to be under control, and this assumption is what caused the catastrophe. So this is a point that we have to be looking at, and if we are looking at our supply chain differently, we have been looking at our supply chain differently, it's time to change the way we think about it. And finally, control is significant hazard. This is a hazard that has been designated as being significant based on severity and likelihood before applying control measures. Will be controlled with preventive control. And a preventive control is what the American law, the FSMA, says is either a process control, which is a CCP, which is no news. We've always had process controls. If I am making a bakery product and I am using eggs, whether they be raw eggs or pasteurized eggs, if I have a baking step that I can control, that will be my CCP, and then I don't care if my supplier has controlled or not controlled that specific hazard because I have the ability to control it. That's our process control, our CCPs. In which case, we can worry a little bit less about that hazard in the supply chain. Another two preventive controls that are mentioned and are required to be identified if it's relevant in the food safety law is sanitation control, allergen control, which we're not going to be talking about now. We're going to we can talk about that maybe in a later seminar. And the fourth preventive control measured is what we call the supply chain control. And supply chain control is as important as a CCP. These are all four of these types of controls, or what we call preventive controls, and they're up there with CCPs. They all have the same importance because they are all controlling significant hazards. So now we are going to be looking at our supply chain control with the same robustness that we're looking at a CCP, and that's a way, and that's a different way of thinking. So that was an overview of why we look differently at supply chain control, starting 2009, 10, 11, until these years. We've been looking at it differently. So if I were to show you this is taken from the FSPCA, that's the official Food Safety Modernization Act course for PCQIs according to the American law, then this is a snapshot of that specific slide from that specific course, and it's telling us the appropriate supply verification activities. This is according to the rule, and it says you must conduct one or more of the following verification activities before using and periodically thereafter. So if a company following FSMA has identified a hazard that is being controlled by a supplier, then we will decide that we have a supply chain preventive control, and we must be controlling it using one or more of these verification activities. And it says your on-site audit, sampling and testing, reviewing their food safety records, or others if applicable. So what I like to do in this short presentation is take you through this and beyond, and teach 6 basic tools for good purchasing practices, in which these are also included. So this is our good purchasing practices toolbox, and it consists of 6 tools that we will choose according to the risk. So we're not going to be using all of these tools on all purchase products, on all hazards. We're going to be choosing out of our toolbox what we need to be applying for that specific hazard and that specific supplier. But these are the things that we can be using. I'll give you a few tips on each one of them. So we have third-party certification. I'll be talking about that. Second-party auditing, direct supervision, certificate of analysis or COA request, control records, and receiving procedures. This is our toolbox, and we'll take them one by one and talk about them. So let's start about talking about third-party certification. Third-party certification is where we require our supplier to be certified by a third party to a scheme that we are happy with. So there are many food safety schemes that we can choose from and ask our suppliers to follow. And if we are a strong enough buyer and the supplier wants to work with us, then they will follow our requirement and obtain certification. The way I see third-party certification is sort of like an entrance exam. If you want to be a candidate to sell to me, you want to come in, you want to put your foot in the door, then obtain third-party certification. I usually will not recommend to do only that. If it's a low-risk product item that I'm buying, I might say, okay, third-party certification, and you can sell to me. As soon as the risk goes up a little bit, we don't want to trust only that, but we must understand which third-party certifications there are, what we can ask for. So what I did is try to put together sort of like a comparison between the different third-party schemes. This is our food safety management system triangle, and the food safety management systems out there are all characterized by 3 major efforts. Our hazard analysis. So every food safety management system on earth requires the supplier or the holder of the certificate to perform a hazard analysis according to some kind of methodology. Some are better than others. The second part of the triangle will be our prerequisite programs, our PRPs, which is what we used to call GMPs, the way we basically manufacture food, under what conditions, and all food safety management systems on earth will require a certain level of prerequisite programs with less or more detail according to the way that system works. And finally, we have our food safety management itself, which is part of a food safety management system. This is our supporting processes like document control and training and calibration and corrective actions and management reviews, the management support system that makes everything work. and all food safety management systems that are certifiable have an element that is food safety management to some degree. So I try to put in a comparison, and I'm looking at 5 different systems. One I call HACCP, HACCP, which is not a food safety management system, and that's important to emphasize. So if a supplier tells me I have HACCP, I'm happy, that's nice, but that's not really something. That there's no such thing as having HACCP. It's not something you have. It's a system that you adopt. So it's part of food safety management. So if I look at HACCP and I want to ask myself, okay, the 3 parts of the triangle includes the risk assessment, the PRP specification, and the food safety management, then HACCP has none of these, only a risk assessment for food safety. Now, I've also added onto this comparison for the benefit of those who see it important, and most of you should. It's not a food safety, it's not a direct food safety issue, but it is mentioned in food safety management systems, VASAP and TASAP. What are these? Well, if HACCP is a hazard analysis of critical control points, TASAP is a threat analysis, and it deals with food security, or the issue of people wanting to harm our food for malicious reasons, to cause us damage with malice. That's the threat. And VASAP is vulnerability assessment, where we deal with people not wanting to harm our food, but wanting to, for economically motivated reasons, changing the food, making it more economically attractive for whoever's manufacturing it, while lying to us. And this vulnerability can lead to a food safety issue. So many management systems include all 3 of these risk assessments, and it's interesting to see which ones require which. So HACCP is just a system for doing a hazard analysis. It does not deal per se with the prerequisite programs. It does not deal with threat or with vulnerability, and it does not have any management elements in it. It's just a system or a method for doing a risk assessment. It's a pretty good one. If we look at the American law, the new American law, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, it has adopted what we call a hazard analysis and risk preventive control approach. Instead of the hazard analysis and critical control point approach, it includes risk preventive controls, as we've seen: sanitation, allergen control, supplier control. And the FSMA does not talk about food safety management. That's not its business. It does have a pretty good PRP specification part, because the rule shows us it's CGMPs that must be followed, and they're pretty specific. Not the most specific you'll find, but pretty good. It does require VASAP included in the risk assessment. It does not deal with TASAP because there's a different rule that deals with food defense. So it's not included there, but it's still an American requirement. And the HACCP, the hazard analysis, is required. Its level of methodology is a little weaker than the classical HACCP, but it's still a good system. Moving on to ISO 22000, which is the food safety management, the first real food safety management system that the world learned about, that we could call a food safety management system, which has been around since 2005, recently revised in 2018. Then we have a pretty good situation. What's going on here is the food safety management part of it is perfect because it is an ISO-based system. So it has a lot of food safety management. It talks a lot about what we call those supports that we want to see supporting our risk assessment and our PRPs, management review and preventive actions and corrective actions and risk and so forth and so on. So it's a pretty good system as far as management. It is very, very weak in its PRP specification. In effect, if you look at the PRP section of ISO 22000, what it says is, okay, certificate holder, we're not going to tell you what PRPs to do. Do whatever the law requires, do whatever you see fit. Use your risk assessment to decide what are good PRPs, what are not. We're not going to specify for you. And this is great. I mean, if you are a manufacturer with a very strong food safety system and you have good PRPs in place, you don't need an external standard to specify for you what to do. On the other hand, if you're going to be buying from somebody and you want to make sure that they're applying the best prerequisite programs, you may not want to trust ISO 22000 all the way, because you don't know, they may be abusing that freedom that ISO 20000 is giving you as a manufacturer. 22000 does not deal with vulnerability or threats, and I gave it 3 pluses for its HACCP because the risk assessment that is described in the standard takes the basic HACCP to another level. So it is requiring us not only to look for CCPs, but also look for OPRPs. And OPRPs widen our choice of preventive measures and takes it outside of the production line. CCPs are in the production line, so pasteurization, metal detection, sieving, whatever, through the line, changing our pHs, whatever we're doing. What OPRPs are doing is taking it beyond the line and adding some of our prerequisite programs to the level of CCPs by introducing OPRPs. So it's a really strong way of doing a risk assessment, very robust and very thorough. Moving on to FSSC 22000, which is a private third-party certification standard that stands out from among other GFSI benchmark standards, for the reason that it is ISO based. It is the only one of the other benchmark standards that include BRC, BRC IOP, IFS, SQF, and so forth, that are all GFSI benchmarked to the same level that FSSC 22000 is benchmarked, but I put it aside because FSSC 22000 is ISO based. So what we're seeing with FSSC 22000 is very strong management system, because it's based on ISO 22000, so it enjoys ISO 22000's management system requirements. A very strong PRP specification, because FSSC 22000 requires us to do ISO 22000 plus ISO TS 22002 specific PRP requirements according to our place in the food chain. So it's very highly specific. It specifies for farming. It specifies another standard for catering, another standard for food manufacturing, for packaging manufacturing, for feed manufacturing, for storage and transportation. So it's making the PRPs as specific as possible within the scheme. It does address both VASAP and TASAP within the requirements of the standard, and it enjoys the same HACCP requirement as ISO 22000 because it's based on it. And I would give the same score for all the other GFSI benchmark, but I take off a plus from management of the food safety and of the HACCP because they are not ISO 22000 based. ISO 22000, in my opinion, has the strongest requirement both for the risk assessment and for the PRPs, and for the management. Another reason why FSC 20000 gets an extra point for me here is because of the possibility of specifying exactly which part of the food chain you belong to. Now, this is my personal opinion. I, by no means, I'm not telling anybody what to do. If anybody enjoys any other scheme more than my opinion, that's fine. I don't get mad at me if you love BRC and say, oh, what is he talking about? BRC is the best. Fine, it's a perfect standard. All the schemes that are accepted by GFSI are wonderful. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when I say GFSI benchmarked, just read up a little about it. It's a whole system of benchmarking international standards for food manufacturing and handling. So we do want to ask our suppliers, by all means, I want you to have a third-party certification. I want to know that somebody else is auditing you, minimum. That's my opinion. That would be my basic requirement. However, sorry about that. However, I do want to emphasize that second-party auditing is in addition to doing third-party certification. So in many cases, if the risk is high enough, I strongly recommend to adopt a second-party auditing scheme, which is the buying organization performing an audit at the supplier's manufacturing site, even though they're third-party certified. This is from my own experience. because I have done many second-party audits as part of what I do for a living. And many times when I do a second-party audit, I find that their management system is less than I would want for my customer. In other words, I say to myself, had I been their third-party certifier, I would not have given them this document, this certificate. So in some cases, organizations are showing a third-party certification certificate that, in my opinion, they're not worthy of. And had my customer that I was sent to audit for on behalf of my customer had purchased from them without having sent to me, just based on a third-party certification, they could find themselves in jeopardy. I thought about this recently. There was a case of this is ongoing. There was a case of aflatoxicosis in dry pet food. I'll talk about that in a second, because recently I did an audit, or a few audits, looking at dry pet food, and it all flashed back to me. So I'll share some of that with you. So second-party audits are highly recommended. FSMA requires them. It's not a recommendation. According to American law, you must do a second-party audit if you want to or don't want you, if the hazard you identified is what we call SACODA. SACODA is an acronym which means serious adverse health consequences or death for humans and animals. So if the hazard you identified in your ingredient, in your purchased product, is a hazard that can cause serious adverse health consequence or death to humans or animals, you must audit your supplier at least once a year. So it's not an option. If the hazard is at a lower level, then you don't have to audit. Then it's highly recommended. So as I said, we're talking right now currently about this issue of aflatoxin in dry dog food. There has been death. I don't know what happened in this case, and I'm sure the company that manufactures this food is a great company, and there are great people doing a great job. But this is a very unfortunate event, and aflatoxicosis in pets is a well-known hazard. Aflatoxin in humans is also a hazard, but it's not as severe as it is with pets. Pets are much more susceptible to being killed from aflatoxin. And the story I remembered was a few years back, one of my customers wanted to outsource dry pet food and put their own name on it, like a private label purchase, and they had some candidates to make their private label pet food. All of these candidate companies had sent them samples. They were all happy with the quality of the product, and they wanted me to assess their food safety management systems. So they sent me on what we call an audit tour. I toured between different plants and audited their food safety management systems. Two of the plants I disqualified based on their risk assessment. And what I did for this presentation was I went into my notes and I copy-pasted a comment that I wrote in the audit. So I'll share that with you. Of course, you cannot identify who was audited. I wouldn't do that. So this is from supplier A, potential supplier A, candidate number A. This is from my audit report. And what I found was the following: the hazard of presence of mycotoxins in raw ingredients was identified as required. So they identified the hazard. However, its severity was classified as level 3 out of 4 severity levels, which surprised me, because aflatoxicosis is death for animals. So why would they put it at level 3? So I asked them, this resulting in the hazard being evaluated as not significant does not justify CCP. So out of their matrix of severity and likelihood, because the severity was 3 out of 4, not 4 out of 4, it wasn't significant, and there was no CCP. So I wrote, because mycotoxicosis is known to be highly lethal to pets, the auditor asked Ms. Doe, that's the name I invented for this person, why the HACCP team chose to classify it as a class 3 hazard, not a class 4. And the answer was that the likelihood of aflatoxicosis is not high enough to justify class 4. So that, for me, was surprising, because we all know that in a good food safety management system, you assess severity and likelihood separately. But the likelihood of aflatoxin in the raw material is very low, I agree. It doesn't happen often. But when it does happen, the severity is very high. So she said that the likelihood is so low that it doesn't justify a level 4 severity. And And what I wrote is the answer was, this answer is unacceptable and indicates a troublesome misunderstanding of HACCP. In order for a risk assessment to be valid, it is crucial to understand that there is never a dependency between severity and likelihood. This is my observation as auditor, and for this observation, this organization was disqualified as a supplier. Because if the food safety team, the head of the food safety team, doesn't understand that specific part of the risk assessment, then I can't trust them with other things. So until they can show evidence that their competence to do a risk assessment is acceptable, I would not recommend my customer who sent me to audit them to purchase food from them and put their name on the label. Moving on to candidate supplier B. This is from that audit report, different audit, different day, different factory. The method for sampling grains was described. So this is an organization that had identified aflatoxin and had put in a CCP. So better news, there's a CCP in place. The CCP was sampling for aflatoxin when they receive the material. So a method for sampling grains was described. According to the description, the sample is manually taken from the truck bed. The sampler tries to take a sample which represents the entire truckload. However, this is not achievable. So what I'm observing is that a truckload of corn is coming in with possible aflatoxin, and the sampler is taking a non-representative sample. So I asked them why, and they said, well, we tried, it's not achievable. The organization they have a designated grain sampling probe. They bought the probe to do the sampling. So they have the equipment. However, it's not in use because it takes too much physical strength to operate. So they're not using their probe for the CCP, even though they should be, which was observed during audit. I asked them about if they thought about alternatives. Automatic robotic sampling has been considered, but it was found to be too expensive. So therefore, the current situation is that the sampling is not representative, and unlike the event of mycotoxin contamination, it will remain undetected. That's the fact. And this is an unacceptable risk considering the potential lethal effect of aflatoxin in pets, blah, blah, blah. So this also is an interesting observation where in audit, both of these plants had third-party certification to the highest level. They showed their certificate. But only when an experienced auditor went on site and went to that specific risk, and this is just a small sample of the audit, and found that level of misunderstanding or misuse of the standards, they were disqualified as suppliers. And finally, they bought from a supplier that had passed the audit, a third supplier. Now, if they had purchased from either of these suppliers, would anything have happened? I don't know. There's no way of knowing. We're only doing the best we can do as far as risk assessment. So there is an important factor in second-party auditing. So we talked about third-party audit certification, second-party auditing. Another tool in our toolbox is direct supervision. This is something that's an option for us to do. It can be performed using external providers and or remote video auditing, or of course, somebody for an organization. So if the hazard is hazardous enough, I can ask my supplier to have me be present and directly observe the way that CCP at my supplier's site is being controlled. I can do it using an external provider who will visit them, and I can also do it using remote video auditing, having them videotape online, closed circuit TV, that CCP being controlled, and having me watch the movie, not having to be there. That is acceptable. So that's what we call direct supervision, being present on site while my product is being manufactured and directly observing it. That's justifiable if the hazard is highly hazardous, with a high-risk hazards, and it's also justifiable with new suppliers I can't trust yet, or that I've had bad experience with in the past, so it can definitely be part of our toolbox. Requesting certificates of analysis is always helpful. We will always, if certificate analysis means that the organization supplying is sending it to a lab, either testing it themselves or sending it out to a lab. It doesn't matter. They're sending it with the results. Of course, I'm talking about results that are relevant to the hazard that was identified: aflatoxin, salmonella, pesticides, heavy metals, whatever identified as being the hazard will be present on the COA. The lab should be authorized. We should be asking them to use authorized labs. They should specify the methods they're using, and the reviewer in the buyer's organization, the person accepting the COA, must be competent. It must be somebody who knows how to read a COA. I often see when I visit organizations that the COA comes with a shipment, with all the paperwork, with the bill of lading and the packing list and the COA and the veterinary certificate and the phytosanitary certificate. It all goes into a package of paper. Somebody staples it and puts it into a file or scans it into the computer, and nobody with real understanding actually reads the COA. And this can be unfortunate because important information is on the COA. So the reviewer must be competent. And when I do a second party audit, you should do this as well, I always bring the COA with me. So then I can compare the COA that I received with one of my shipments. I can compare what's going on there and make sure that their COA is authentic and actually represents the results they received for that specific test. So it's a way of doing a verification of the authenticity of the COA. Control records. Along with the paperwork provided, we can also ask our supplier to attach control records that show the control of the specific hazard that's being controlled. So it's relevant for all CCPs and all OPRPs. Anything that's being controlled, any preventive control, has control records that come with it. I can ask them to add that to my paperwork if I want. This also can be done by remote video auditing. So I can actually ask to see a video showing me the control record being filled out as it's being controlled. If it's a temperature curve, if it's a pH curve, if it's a chlorine level in disinfection, whatever I want to be looking at. I once did a control record review for a product that had to be thermally processed, and I identified on the control review that the temperatures were below the required temperature and not above. And when we tried to find out what was going on, it turned out that the operator operating that specific thermal process, for some reason, was under the impression that the temperature had to be below the required temperature to prevent the product from burning. They had no concept of thermal treatment for microbial reasons, which was really surprising. It blew my mind, but that was the reality, the situation that was picked up by controlling records of that specific CCP. The reviewer here must also be competent, must be somebody who understands what they're reading with the paperwork, just like with the COA. And finally, we can have receiving procedures in place, which means when the supplied product arrives at our site, we will accept it according to a receiving procedure that we've devised according to our needs. And this will be on a case-to-case basis based on the risk. So we will do receiving procedures. And now one thing I want to emphasize that Salmonella and Listeria specifically cannot be ruled out following negative acceptance tests. This is one of the mistakes that I often see. So if I've identified a Listeria monocytogenes or Salmonella as a potential hazard, and I'm trusting my supplier to be controlling it, and I decide that every shipment I'm going to test for Salmonella and Listeria to make sure to verify that my supplier has actually killed the bugs, I'm making a big mistake. The chances of me picking it up on acceptance are very low. I can use acceptance testing for many other things, but in this specific case, it doesn't work. I can't trust it. I'm not saying don't test for Salmonella and Listeria. By all means, test for it as a verification method for what we call periodic verification for our database, but not instead of anything else. It's not a control measure. I can't rule it out when it's not there. One of the things that I try to explain to people when they ask me that, well, it doesn't make sense, right, is using this analogy, what I call a fish pond analogy. And ruling out Salmonella or Listeria from doing a microbial examination is like going to a fish pond and putting a net and bringing the net up and seeing that it has no fish in it, and then coming to the conclusion that there are no fish in the pond. With biological critters like Salmonella and Listeria, which have flagella, they swim around, they're animals, they're little swimmers, they're tiny, but they move. They can all be in one corner. They can be. It's not like a chemical feature that is dispersed throughout the matrix. They can be moving around, and also very small numbers can cause significant harm. So that's why we rule out Listeria. Of course, if the net does find a fish, then we know for sure, 100%, that there are fish in the pond. We do not retest. Retesting for Salmonella, if we find a positive, would be like putting the fish back in the pond, taking another sample and now having no fish and saying, oh, thank God, there are no fish in that pond. That's as much sense as it would make to retest for salmonella, which is one of the things that they were doing at Peanut Corporation, which got them in so much trouble. They were retesting after they had found positive salmonella and using the negative results on their COAs. What the prosecution called in the PCA trial cherry picking the results. We can't do that. So, on my live presentation, there would be time for questions, but because this is recorded, then if you have any questions, you can write them to me by email or send them to Simon. He'll get them to me. I'd be happy to answer. Just took a few minutes of our time to look at the subject of supply chain management as a risk management system, and understanding some of the tools in our toolbox to better put together a package. To sum it up, what I recommend doing is do a thorough risk assessment of every single ingredient and every single packaging material that we are purchasing, taking the time to do risk assessment, putting together the potential hazards, and deciding for each one which tools do we want to apply and to what extent to be able to say we're doing a reasonable job in preventing hazards. I want to stress that the whole idea behind a risk assessment is not to do everything we can do. This is a myth buster. Nobody's expected to do all they can do because you can always do more. The question is, how much do I do? When do I stop? And based on what? And that's why we do a risk assessment. So we can always do more. Nobody expects us to do everything because it would be unfeasible. But we must do what we should do based on risk assessment. That's my final message. And I want to thank you so much for your attention. And if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me, and I'd be happy to help. Thank you very much.